She saved a Mafia princess, but never expected to change the boss's heart. Rain fell over New York like the sky itself had broken apart. A relentless downpour that blurred the sharp glow of streetlights into trembling halos, washing the city in silver sorrow. Elena Martinez walked fast through the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn, her shoes splashing in cold puddles, her thin jacket clinging to her shivering frame. The air was heavy with exhaust and rain, the scent of wet asphalt mingling with the faint aroma of roasted peanuts from a vendor who had already packed up for the night. It was nearly midnight, the streets quieter than usual, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional hiss of tires slicing through water. Elena's eyes were tired, her face pale under the flickering glow of a lamppost, but her heart pressed forward with the same stubborn rhythm it always did, beating to the tune of survival. She had just finished her double shift at the diner, where she smiled through exhaustion for tips that barely covered her mother's medicine. Her hands still smelled faintly of coffee and detergent, her feet ached from hours on the greasy tiles, and her mind wandered between worry and fatigue. Her mother's face haunted her thoughts, fragile, sickly, lying in the dim light of their apartment, every cough echoing like a warning that time was running out. The rain soaked through Elena's jacket, but she didn't mind. She had known worse nights. Nights when the fridge was empty, when rent was overdue, when loneliness wrapped around her like the cold wind now biting her cheeks. Yet something about this night felt different. The rain had an eerie rhythm, as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As she turned down the narrow alley that served as her usual shortcut home, her reflection trembled in a puddle beneath the streetlight. The sound of screeching tires shattered the fragile silence. Her head snapped up. Two black SUVs skidded to a stop at the far end of the street, their headlights slicing through the rain like white knives. Panic rippled through her chest. For a moment, she thought of running, but instinct told her to stay still, to listen. Then came the scream, a small, terrified voice that pierced through the storm. Elena's heart lurched. It was the voice of a child. "Help! Please!" The sound bounced off the brick walls, echoing like a plea from the heavens. Without thinking, Elena dropped her purse and sprinted toward the sound, her boots slapping against the wet pavement. She saw them then, three masked men, their dark figures illuminated briefly by the headlights, dragging a little girl toward one of the vans. The girl couldn't have been more than 10, her white dress soaked and clinging to her small body, her tiny hands flailing in terror. "Let me go!" she screamed, kicking at the men's legs, but her cries were swallowed by the rain. Elena didn't think about the danger, didn't stop to calculate the odds. Something primal surged through her veins, a mixture of fury and fear, and before she realized it, she was grabbing the first thing she could find, a rusty metal pipe leaning against a dumpster. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to make the men glance her way. The world seemed to slow. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, but her heart roared louder. She swung the pipe, catching one of the kidnappers across the arm with a dull thud. He cursed and turned toward her, his gloved fist catching her cheek with brutal force, sending her sprawling onto the wet ground. Pain exploded across her face, but Elena refused to stop. She rolled, gritted her teeth, and swung again, this time hitting his knee. He stumbled, snarling like an animal. The second man advanced on her, yanking her by the hair, but Elena bit his wrist so hard that blood filled her mouth, metallic and bitter. "You stupid!" he shouted, but before he could finish, the sound of a window opening above them drew his attention. A neighbor had noticed. Another voice shouted from somewhere down the street. The commotion was growing. The kidnappers exchanged glances, panic flashing behind their masks. "We gotta go," one of them barked. The man closest to the van shoved the girl inside, but Elena lunged again, her fingers catching the child's wrist. For a split second, they were locked in a desperate tug-of-war, the girl's terrified eyes meeting Elena's. "Don't let them take me!" the girl screamed. Elena's muscles screamed in protest, but she pulled with every ounce of strength left in her. The masked man lost his grip, stumbled backward, and the girl fell into Elena's arms just as the van door slammed shut. "Drive!" someone yelled. The tires screeched again, mud and water spraying across Elena's face as the van sped off into the storm. For a long second, everything was still except for the sound of rain hammering against the rooftops. Elena clutched the girl tightly, feeling her small frame tremble with sobs. The child's hair was tangled, her hands bruised, her wide brown eyes filled with a fear no child should ever know. Elena's breath came in ragged bursts, her chest burning. Her cheek throbbed where she had been hit, but none of it mattered. She had saved her. The girl's little fingers dug into Elena's jacket. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling between sobs. "Don't let them take me again." Elena held her tighter, shielding her from the rain with her own body. "You're safe now," she murmured, even though she wasn't sure it was true. The street was empty again, except for the distant echo of sirens that hadn't yet reached them. Elena looked around, the puddles reflecting flashes of red and white light from passing cars. The dumpsters, the dripping fire escape, all of it felt unreal. Like she had stepped into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her mind raced. Who were those men? Why were they after this child? And what kind of world allowed something so cruel to unfold in the shadows of a city that never slept? She tried to steady her breathing. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a strand of wet hair from the girl's face. "You're safe with me." But the girl shook her head violently. "They'll come back," she cried. "They said they would find me no matter what." Elena's stomach tightened. She wanted to ask more, to understand, but the child's trembling was growing worse, her lips turning blue from the cold. Elena wrapped her own jacket around her and stood. "We have to get you out of this rain," she said gently. The girl didn't protest. She just clung to her neck as Elena carried her down the street, her own legs weak from exhaustion and adrenaline. The wind howled between the buildings, carrying with it the distant wail of a police siren. As they reached the end of the alley, an old man appeared from his window across the street, holding a phone. "You okay, miss? Should I call someone?" he shouted. Elena nodded weakly. "Please, call the police." Her voice cracked, but relief flooded her chest. For the first time since the chaos began, she felt a sliver of safety. The old man disappeared, and moments later, the faint blue flash of patrol lights appeared through the rain. The girl's sobs had quieted into soft whimpers now, her small body finally relaxing in Elena's arms, though her grip on Elena's shirt remained firm, as if letting go meant falling back into the nightmare. Elena's mind, however, was a whirlwind. She didn't even know the girl's name. She didn't know why those men wanted her. All she knew was that something far bigger than her had just crashed into her life, and she could already feel the weight of it pressing on her soul. She glanced at the alley behind her, the broken pipe lying in a puddle, the dark skid marks on the road, and shivered. She had faced danger before in small ways, debt collectors, street thieves, the cruelty of poverty, but this was different. This was the kind of danger that left scars you couldn't see. The police arrived moments later, 2 officers stepping out, their coats pulled tight against the rain. "What happened here?" one of them asked, but Elena's voice failed her for a moment. The words wouldn't form. She just looked down at the girl, who now seemed impossibly small in her arms. Finally, she found the strength to speak. "They tried to take her," she whispered. "I stopped them." The officer looked at her, then at the tire tracks, the discarded mask that had fallen from one of the men, and nodded grimly. "You did good, miss. Real good." But Elena didn't feel good. Her hands were shaking, her heart still racing. She could still feel the weight of the man's punch, the sting of blood on her lip, the echo of the child's scream. When one of the officers reached for the girl, the child clung tighter to Elena, refusing to let go. "No. Don't take me," she cried. Elena crouched down, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. They're here to help." Slowly, gently, the girl loosened her grip, allowing the officer to take her hand. Elena watched as they wrapped the child in a blanket from the patrol car. Then, as if the adrenaline had finally run out, Elena's legs gave way, and she sank to the curb. Rain soaked her hair, her clothes, her very soul. The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her body told another story. Pain radiated from her cheek and ribs, but she ignored it. Her gaze was fixed on the girl, who sat quietly now in the back seat of the patrol car, her small face half hidden behind the blanket. The girl looked back at her for a moment, those same wide, frightened eyes meeting Elena's through the rain-streaked window. Something in that look cut deep into Elena's heart, a silent thank you mixed with fear. And though she didn't know it yet, that single glance would change her life forever. Rain kept falling long after the sirens faded. The storm's rhythm slowing from a roar to a whisper that wrapped the city in trembling silence. And Elena remained on the curb, her body numb while her mind drifted somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Staring at the streaks of red and blue light reflecting off the wet pavement as if the colors themselves were bleeding into the night. She could hear the faint crackle of the police radio. The low murmur of officers reporting details she barely processed. The child's muffled voice giving her name, Isabella, like a ghost whispering through the rain. And that name anchored itself deep inside Elena's chest, pulsing with fragile life. She rose slowly, her knees trembling, the ache from the fight settling deep in her bones. And she leaned against the brick wall to steady herself, feeling the rough, cold surface scrape her palm while a metallic taste lingered in her mouth from the blood where her lip had split. The officer nearest to her offered a small smile. The kind meant to reassure victims when words failed. And handed her a folded blanket from the trunk of the patrol car. But Elena shook her head, whispering that the girl needed it more. The officer hesitated before nodding, telling her that detectives would want to speak with her soon, then turned to radio for backup units. Leaving Elena alone under the streetlight that flickered weakly against the gray sky. She looked down at her trembling hands, small, pale, dotted with cuts, and tried to make sense of what she had just done. In a single heartbeat she had crossed from ordinary to extraordinary. From invisible waitress to someone who had fought masked men with nothing but instinct and a piece of rusted metal. And now the reality of it hit her all at once. She felt her stomach twist. Adrenaline drained away, leaving only nausea and a deep hollow ache behind her ribs. Around her, the city continued breathing, distant traffic. A barking dog, the hum of neon signs that refused to sleep, but inside her chest. Everything was still when the paramedics arrived. They wrapped her in a silver thermal sheet that shimmered beneath the streetlights like foil wings, but she didn't feel heroic. She felt small, drenched, and strangely empty. Questions swirled through her mind faster than the rainwater racing toward the gutters. Who were those men? Why that child? Would they come back? Yet every answer seemed lost in the darkness. One paramedic dabbed antiseptic on her bruised cheek, and she winced. Another handed her a cup of water, which she held without drinking. The taste of fear clung to her tongue. She could hear Isabella in the ambulance a few feet away, her soft sobs punctuated by gentle reassurances from a medic, and that sound both broke and steadied her. It reminded her why she had acted, why her body had moved before her mind could protest. Something about that little voice had reached a place inside her long forgotten, the same place that had learned to protect her own mother when life turned cruel. The rain eased to a drizzle, fine mist curling in the cold air as dawn hinted faintly at the horizon, turning the black sky into a bruised purple. A detective in a long coat approached her, notebook in hand, voice low but firm. "Miss Martinez, right? Can you walk me through what happened?" he asked, and she nodded, speaking slowly through trembling lips. Recounting every detail she could remember, the cars, the masks, the sound of the girl screaming, the fight, the neighbors shouting, the moment the van tore away. The detective scribbled fast, occasionally glancing up with eyes that mixed disbelief and respect. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. Elena managed a faint, tired smile. "She's lucky," she replied, and her voice cracked on the last word. The detective gave her a card, promising someone would contact her for a statement and that she shouldn't worry, they'd find whoever was behind this. But his confidence felt thin, like a blanket too small to cover the truth. As the officers packed up the scene, placing the fallen pipe into an evidence bag, Elena felt a strange pull to stay, as though leaving would mean abandoning something sacred. The puddles glimmered with fractured reflections of flashing lights. Cigarette butts floated beside crushed cans. Everything ordinary now carried the weight of what had just happened. She thought of her mother waiting at home, unaware of the chaos her daughter had just survived, and guilt stabbed through her chest. She imagined the worry when she didn't return on time, the clock ticking beside the old medicine bottles, the single lamp burning in their apartment window like a beacon in the dark. She asked an officer if she could go, and he nodded, offering to have a patrol car drive her, but she refused. She needed to walk, to feel the ground beneath her, to prove to herself she was still real. The streets were eerily quiet now, washed clean by the rain yet still carrying the scent of smoke and fear. Elena's footsteps echoed between the damp walls, mingling with the faint hiss of steam from manhole covers. Every corner she turned seemed to replay fragments of the attack, glimpses of the men's eyes through the masks, the sting of fists, the sound of a child crying for mercy. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold but from the weight of memory pressing against her ribs. By the time she reached her building, a decaying brownstone with peeling paint and a broken buzzer, the first light of morning had crept across the sky, painting the clouds in soft streaks of gold. She unlocked the door quietly, slipping inside the narrow hallway that smelled of old wood and damp carpet. Her mother's voice came faintly from the apartment upstairs, calling her name with worry that made her heart ache. "I'm here, Mama," she whispered, forcing her voice to sound normal. Inside, the warmth of their small home wrapped around her like an old blanket, the hiss of the radiator, the faint scent of chamomile tea, the ticking of the clock above the stove. Her mother, thin and pale but sharp-eyed, looked up from the couch, relief flooding her face. "You're soaked. What happened?" she asked, but Elena couldn't bring herself to tell the truth, not yet. She smiled weakly, saying there had been a car accident nearby, that she'd stayed to help, that everything was fine. Her mother fussed over her, drying her hair with a towel, scolding her for staying out so late, and Elena nodded through it all. Her mind elsewhere, still in that alley, still hearing the echoes of that small voice, when her mother finally went back to rest. Elena sat by the window, staring out at the gray dawn. Across the street, a newspaper truck pulled up, unloading stacks of early editions wrapped in plastic. The city was waking again, indifferent to the terror that had unfolded while it slept. A bus roared past, splashing through puddles, scattering pigeons from the sidewalk. The ordinary rhythm of life resumed, but Elena felt suspended outside of it, as though she were watching from a distance. She peeled back the curtain slightly and caught sight of a police cruiser parked a block away, perhaps still investigating, perhaps keeping watch, and the faint knowledge that she was now part of some story larger than herself tightened her chest. She thought of Isabella again, the girl's tear-streaked face, the way her fingers had clung with desperate trust. A stranger's child, yet somehow she felt responsible for her, bound by invisible thread woven in that moment of chaos. Elena pressed her hand to the cold window pane, whispering a silent prayer that the girl would be safe, wherever the police had taken her. She didn't know that same prayer would echo through her life for years to come. All she knew was the trembling sense that something had shifted forever inside her. As the rain finally stopped and a weak sun pushed through the clouds, Elena changed into dry clothes, her body covered in bruises but her spirit oddly awake. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator sounded louder, sharper, as if the world had been turned up a notch. She brewed a cup of coffee but barely drank it, staring instead at the steam curling upward like ghosts of the night before. On the table lay her wallet, a few crumpled bills, and the detective's business card, its edges damp from the rain. She traced the printed name with her fingertip, wondering if she'd hear from them again, wondering what would happen to Isabella, wondering why fate had chosen her to stand in that alley at that exact moment. Her mother stirred in the next room, coughing softly, and Elena rose to check on her, pulling the blanket higher over her frail shoulders. The tenderness of that small gesture contrasted sharply with the violence she'd witnessed, and for a fleeting second she wondered if the world always balanced its cruelty with kindness. When she returned to the window, the sky had cleared completely, revealing streaks of soft blue, the kind of calm that only comes after a storm has exhausted itself. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her heart, feeling it beat steady again, and whispered to herself that it was over, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice told her the night of chaos had only just begun. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the threadbare curtains of Elena's apartment, slicing the dimness into pale bands that stretched across the floor like hesitant promises of peace, but peace had no business here. Not today. She sat at the small kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside her, still wearing yesterday's bruises like confessions on her skin. Her mother slept in the next room, unaware that the world outside their door had shifted overnight. The city was alive again, horns blaring, dogs barking, neighbors arguing about parking, but beneath that ordinary hum, Elena felt a pulse of unease, the echo of rain and screams still trapped inside her chest. When the first black car pulled up outside, she barely noticed, thinking it was just another early commuter. But then came a second, and a third, engines idling low and deliberate, the kind of synchronized precision that belonged to people who never moved without purpose. Through the cracked window she watched men in tailored suits step out, their shoes gleaming even in the dust of the street, their movements crisp, quiet, rehearsed. For a fleeting moment she wondered if they were police, detectives maybe, but the way they scanned the area, alert, protective, predatory, told her otherwise. A knot formed in her throat. She had spent her whole life avoiding trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had found her anyway. The soft thud of knuckles rapping on her door made her jump. It wasn't a polite knock. It was an announcement. Elena hesitated, her pulse thrumming like a trapped bird. She glanced toward her mother's room, then back to the door. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice unsteady. A calm male voice answered, "Signorina Martinez? Mr. Moretti would like a word." The name hit her like a gust of cold air. Moretti. She'd heard it whispered in the diner late at night by cops and cab drivers alike, the kind of name that traveled in low tones and wary glances. Everyone knew Vincenzo Moretti, the quiet storm who ruled New York's underworld from the shadows. And now, apparently, he was outside her door. Her fingers trembled on the lock before she turned it. The door swung open to reveal a wall of black suits and rain-slick coats. They stepped aside, and between them emerged a tall man whose very presence seemed to still the air. Vincenzo Moretti was not loud, nor flamboyant. His authority didn't need to shout. It was in the way he walked, measured, deliberate, and in the way his pale eyes studied her, as if he could read her heartbeat through her skin. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, silver cufflinks glinting beneath the cuff, his hair slicked back with the effortless precision of someone who never allowed chaos to touch him. Behind him, two men waited in silence. Another stood guard by the door. Elena swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table to keep her hands from shaking. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the steady tick of the wall clock and the faint hiss of traffic far below. Then Vincenzo's voice broke the silence, low, controlled, and edged with something dangerous. "You saved my daughter." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Elena blinked, unsure whether it was gratitude or interrogation. "I just did what anyone would do," she managed, her voice soft but firm. A flicker of something, amusement, disbelief, touched his lips, vanishing as quickly as it came. "No one," he said slowly, "does what you did. Not for my family." His gaze moved to the bruises on her face, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw concern buried beneath the ice. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, thick enough that it bent slightly between his fingers. He set it on the table beside her cold coffee. "For your trouble," he said. The envelope lay there like an accusation, the corner damp from his wet glove. Elena stared at it, feeling the weight of what it represented, not gratitude but debt, not kindness but obligation. She shook her head. "I don't want your money," she whispered. "Just make sure she's safe." The room seemed to pause around those words. One of his men shifted uncomfortably, as if unaccustomed to refusal. Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but the air did, thicker now, charged with disbelief. He studied her again, longer this time, eyes narrowing slightly as though he were seeing something he hadn't expected. "You think this is about money?" he asked quietly. "Everything is about money." "Not this," she said. Her voice surprised even her. It carried a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. Vincenzo exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of something human breaking through his polished veneer, a sigh, maybe admiration, maybe irritation. He motioned for his men to step outside. They obeyed instantly, leaving the two of them alone in the small apartment that suddenly felt too fragile to contain the magnitude of his presence. He glanced around, the peeling wallpaper, the single flickering bulb, the photographs of her mother and herself on the shelf, and when he spoke again his tone softened, though the steel remained. "My daughter won't forget what you did," he said. "Neither will I." He turned toward the door as if to leave, but hesitated, his back to her, rain glinting on his shoulders. "If you ever need anything," he added, "you'll find a way to reach me." Then he was gone. His footsteps fading down the stairwell, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the envelope she hadn't touched. Elena sank into the chair, the world spinning in the silence he left behind. She stared at the envelope as though it might bite. Outside, engines started one after another, the synchronized growl of power rolling through the street. Through the window she watched the black cars pull away, their reflections sliding across the wet pavement until they disappeared into traffic. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled violently, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, electric realization that she had just spoken to one of the most dangerous men in the city and survived it. She lifted the envelope, felt its thickness, then dropped it onto the table again as if it burned. The clock ticked louder, matching the rhythm of her pulse. Somewhere below, a dog barked. Somewhere above, her mother coughed. Life went on, absurdly ordinary in the wake of extraordinary. 4 hours after Vincenzo left, Elena sat frozen at the table, her mind replaying every second of the encounter, the measured tone of his voice, the weight of his stare, the way his presence had filled the room like smoke. She touched the side of her neck where a bruise had begun to bloom and felt the sting of it, a reminder of the night before and of how close she had come to something far bigger than herself. Her mother's voice eventually drifted from the bedroom, faint and sleepy, asking if everything was all right. "Just some people from work," Elena lied, forcing steadiness into her tone. She tucked the envelope into a drawer, out of sight but not out of mind. Every time she tried to rest, her thoughts circled back to that man's face, those glacial eyes that had seemed to strip her bare and yet, somehow, hadn't frightened her as much as they should have. There had been something behind them, something unspoken, as though even monsters carried ghosts of their own. She had heard stories about men like him all her life, but none of them had mentioned the silence in his voice, the tiredness behind his power. When she finally drifted into sleep, the rain had started again, tapping softly against the window like a restless heartbeat. The next morning, Elena's routine felt oddly fragile. At the diner, the regulars noticed the bandage on her arm, but she brushed off their questions with tight smiles. The news played on the small TV above the counter, reports of gunfire near the docks. Whispers of another gang war brewing, but she tuned it out, focusing instead on the hiss of the coffee machine, the rhythm of her tray, the steady motion that kept her from thinking. Yet somewhere in the city, the Moretti name was being spoken differently that morning, with gratitude, with confusion, with caution. Word had spread that someone had saved Vincenzo Moretti's only child, and that the Don himself had visited her home. It was the kind of rumor that traveled fast and changed everything it touched. Even if she hadn't meant to, Elena had stepped into a world she didn't belong to. Late that afternoon, as she wiped down tables, a man in a black coat entered the diner, ordered nothing, and simply left a white envelope on the counter with her name written in elegant handwriting. She opened it after her shift, half expecting more money, but inside there was only a note. "She keeps asking for you." Her chest tightened. She could almost hear the little girl's trembling voice from that night, the way she had clung to her, whispering not to let them take her again. Despite herself, Elena smiled softly. Maybe she'd see her again, she thought. Though a part of her knew it was better if she didn't. Still, something inside her stirred, a thread that tied her fate, however unwillingly, to the man whose world she had accidentally entered. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the wet asphalt. She walked home beneath the orange glow, feeling the city's pulse around her, a restless hum of lives colliding in ways they weren't meant to. Some were far away, in a penthouse guarded by men who killed for him without hesitation. Vincenzo Moretti stood by his daughter's bedside, watching her sleep. The little girl murmured Elena's name in her dreams, and for the first time in years, the Don of New York felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something dangerously close to gratitude. And in that quiet moment, he knew one thing for certain: their paths were not finished crossing. Fate, once awakened, does not easily fall back to sleep. Days trickled by an uneasy quiet. The kind of stillness that makes you wonder if the storm has truly passed or if it's only gathering strength beyond the horizon. For Elena, life seemed to crawl back towards something like normality: mornings at the diner, evenings caring for her mother, nights haunted by dreams of that black-eyed chaos. She told herself that whatever had happened with the Morettis was finished, that the man and his world had returned to their marble towers and locked gates. But destiny, she would learn, never asks permission before it returns. It began with a knock far gentler than the ones before, so soft she almost missed it over the sound of boiling pasta water. When she opened the door, expecting the landlord or perhaps a neighbor, she froze in disbelief. There stood Isabella Moretti, tiny, poised, dressed in a pale pink coat that looked far too delicate for her small frame, clutching a teddy bear in one hand and a paper bag in the other. Her wide green eyes lifted toward Elena's, bright with determination. "Papa says thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to thank you too." Behind her, a man in a black suit stood watch from a discreet distance, his earpiece glinting in the morning light. For a moment, Elena didn't know whether to laugh or panic. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't be here," she said, kneeling down. "It's not safe for you to walk around like this." Isabella shook her head, curls bouncing. "Papa's driver brought me. He said you make the best soup in the world." The words melted something inside Elena's chest before her mind could object. She glanced past the girl toward the waiting car, saw the driver's patient nod, and sighed. "All right then," she said softly. But only for a little while. That little while stretched into hours. Isabella explored the small apartment with the wonder of a child who had only ever known marble floors and bodyguards. She traced her fingers along the chipped windowsill, admired the potted plant that Elena had nursed back to life, and giggled when the old radio crackled mid-song. "It smells nice in here," she said, watching as Elena stirred the pot on the stove. "At home everything smells like polish." Elena smiled faintly. "That's because rich people have someone else cook for them. Here, I have to do it myself." The girl laughed, the sound pure and bell-like. They ate together at the small table, steam rising from their bowls. Isabella's manners were impeccable, her posture perfect, yet she slurped the soup like any child when she thought Elena wasn't looking. By the time the driver returned, Isabella refused to leave. "Can I come again?" she asked, clutching her bear. Elena hesitated, torn between reason and the aching tenderness the girl had stirred in her. "You should ask your father," she said. "I'll ask him," Isabella promised, smiling with a confidence that seemed far too sure for her age. And the next day, she came again. At first, Elena thought it was a mistake, that the driver had misunderstood, but soon it became clear that Isabella's visits were deliberate, perhaps even unstoppable. Each afternoon she appeared with a new excuse: to bring leftovers, to show a drawing, to share a story. She would sit cross-legged on the worn rug, watching as Elena folded laundry or chopped vegetables, asking questions about everything from grocery prices to the color of sunsets. "You're funny," Isabella would say, "not like Papa's friends." And Elena, despite every warning voice in her head, couldn't help but adore her. The girl was a light in a world too full of darkness. When Isabella's laughter filled the apartment, even Elena's mother, frail and mostly silent, seemed to wake from her fog, smiling at the sound. It wasn't long before Elena found herself humming lullabies again, songs her own mother used to sing, while Isabella dozed on the couch. Her tiny hand curled trustingly around Elena's sleeve. But peace, like all fragile things, never lasts long when it's borrowed from dangerous men. One evening, just as dusk painted the sky with streaks of violet, a different car arrived. Elena opened the door and froze. Vincenzo stood there, expression carved from marble, his presence filling the hallway before he even stepped inside. His gaze flicked instantly to the small figure curled asleep on the couch, and something sharp flashed in his eyes, not anger at first, but shock, then confusion, then something else altogether. "What is she doing here?" he asked quietly. Elena straightened, her heart thudding against her ribs. "She came on her own. I tried to." He lifted a hand, silencing her. His voice remained calm but cold, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "She has guards, a driver, a schedule. She doesn't simply come on her own." Elena wanted to speak, to explain that children have a way of slipping through the cracks that even power can't seal, but the words tangled in her throat. He took a slow step toward the couch, his polished shoes barely whispering against the floorboards. Isabella stirred at the sound of his voice. Papa? She murmured sleepily, her small hand reaching out. And in that instant, something in him shifted. The steel in his gaze softened as she blinked up at him, smiling with the innocent warmth only children possess. Did you have fun, Bella? He asked, his voice lower now. She nodded eagerly, sitting up and tugging at his sleeve. Miss Elena made soup, and we played cards, and she sang songs like Mama used to. The word Mama hung between them like a fragile ghost. Vincenzo's breath hitched, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Elena saw it clearly. The man who ruled the city's underworld, who could make men disappear with a gesture, suddenly looked like a father caught between grief and gratitude. He sat down beside his daughter, the hard lines of his face softening under the weight of her smile. For the first time since his wife's death, he saw joy in Isabella's eyes, not forced, not polite, but alive. The sight pierced through the armor he had built around himself, and he found himself glancing at Elena, his expression unreadable. You've done more than save her life, he said quietly. You've reminded her how to live. Elena felt her cheeks warm under his gaze but said nothing. Words seemed too clumsy for the strange stillness that filled the room. Isabella leaned against her father's shoulder, humming one of the songs Elena had taught her. The Mafia boss looked down at his daughter, then at the woman who had brought that song back into their world. And for once he didn't know which of them he owed more later. When he finally rose to leave, Isabella clung to Elena one last time. Can I come again? She whispered. Elena hesitated, her heart torn. She looked at Vincenzo, expecting refusal, but he only sighed, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across his lips. We'll see, he said. As the car pulled away, its red taillights glowing like embers against the night, Elena stood at the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and something dangerously close to longing. She told herself it was about the child, that she simply cared for Isabella's happiness, but deep down she knew the truth was more complicated. The girl had become a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch, and somewhere along that fragile connection, Elena had begun to wonder what kind of man hid behind the legend of Vincenzo Moretti. In his daughter's laughter, she had glimpsed not a criminal, but a father, broken and human. And though she didn't yet realize it, that single truth would soon change everything, for her, for him, and for the empire of shadows that bound them both, that night. Long after the city had folded itself into darkness, Vincenzo sat alone in the glow of a single lamp, the quiet hum of rain seeping through the glass walls of his penthouse. His empire slept beneath him, streets, men, debts, secrets, all obedient, all under control, and yet within this vast dominion of fear, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Across the room, on the wide leather couch, Isabella lay fast asleep, her tiny hand resting on Elena's arm as if it belonged there. The sight pierced him in ways he didn't expect. Elena had dozed off too, her head tilted slightly toward the child, her hair falling like a curtain over her cheek, her breathing soft and steady. The simplicity of it, the safety of his daughter wrapped in someone else's care, was unbearable and beautiful all at once. Vincenzo leaned back in his chair, the quiet ticking of his wristwatch marking the rhythm of a man unaccustomed to stillness. He had lived a life measured in blood and loyalty, not moments like this. Every victory, every dollar, every life taken or spared had been calculated, justified, necessary. But this fragile peace bought by a stranger's kindness, was something he couldn't measure or control. For years he had convinced himself that power was love's closest replacement, that safety could be built from fear, that walls and guards could stand in for a father's embrace. Yet as he looked at the gentle curve of Isabella's smile, the lie unraveled before his eyes. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling faintly in his hand. The reflection staring back from the crystal was older than he remembered, lines deeper, eyes colder. A stranger molded by choices he could no longer take back. He thought of the men who called him Don Moretti, who bowed their heads and waited for orders, who killed and lied and bled at his command. None of them had ever seen him hesitate. None of them had ever seen him human. But here, in the dim quiet of his own home, he was no Don, no legend, just a man terrified of losing the one thing he hadn't yet destroyed. He rose and walked to the window, the city sprawling beneath him like a living map of his sins. Neon lights flickered across his reflection, casting him in shifting shades of guilt and gold. He had given this city everything, his youth, his conscience, his soul, and in return, it had given him everything but peace. He had built an empire strong enough to make governments tremble, but he couldn't give his daughter the one thing she truly needed, warmth. And then came Elena, poor, brave, ordinary Elena, who had done it without effort, without agenda, without fear. The realization stung like confession. He turned, his gaze falling again on the couch. Elena stirred in her sleep, her hand brushing lightly against Isabella's hair. The gesture was small, instinctive, but to Vincenzo it felt like revelation. It reminded him of his late wife, Sophia, her tenderness, her laughter, the way she used to hum while brushing Isabella's hair before bed. That was before everything soured, before bullets and betrayals carved emptiness into his world. He had sworn after Sophia's death that love was weakness, that attachments were the weapons enemies used to destroy men like him. He had buried himself in business, in vengeance, in the illusion of control. But watching Elena and Isabella now, he realized he'd only been hiding from the truth. He wasn't protecting his daughter from the world, he was protecting himself from her love. Because love demanded honesty, and honesty was something he'd long since forgotten how to give. He sank onto the edge of the couch, careful not to wake them. The faint scent of Elena's hair, soap and rain, drifted toward him, mingling with the soft rhythm of Isabella's breathing. His hand hovered for a moment before he brushed a strand of hair from his daughter's face. She murmured something unintelligible in her sleep, and he felt the sharp ache of guilt lodge deeper in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words barely left his lips. He wasn't sure who he was apologizing to, his daughter, his dead wife, or the part of himself that still remembered what mercy felt like. He sat there for a long time, unmoving, until the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains. Then, with the resolve of a man who had made 1,000 ruthless decisions but never one quite like this, he stood and called for his lieutenant. Luca arrived quietly. A tall, stoic man with years of loyalty etched into his scarred face. He stopped short when he saw the sleeping pair on the couch but didn't speak until Vincenzo turned toward him. "Boss?" he asked. Vincenzo's eyes were distant, unreadable. "From now on," he said, his voice low but firm, "you keep men on her building. Discreet. Around the clock." Luca hesitated. "The waitress?" Vincenzo's gaze hardened. "Her name is Elena. No one touches her. Ever. Not the police, not our people, not our enemies. If anyone even looks her way wrong, I want to know before they breathe twice." Luca blinked, startled by the gravity in his tone, but nodded. "Understood." The order spread through the organization before sunrise, whispered in corridors, repeated in bars and backrooms. The dawn has given protection to a woman outside the family. No one dared question it, but everyone wondered who she was to him. Some said she was a mistress, others a debt of honor, others still a secret weapon. None knew the truth, that she was simply the one person who had reminded him that his heart was still capable of breaking. When Vincenzo finally retired to his study, the weight of his command settled over him like a confession he couldn't take back. He sat behind his desk, the city still waking beyond the glass, and opened the drawer where he kept the few relics of his past, his wedding ring, a photo of Sophia holding a baby Isabella, and now, the drawing Isabella had made at Elena's apartment. Crayons had scrawled an image of 3 figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. The child's handwriting beneath it read, "Me, Papa, and Miss Elena." His throat tightened. He traced the uneven letters with his thumb, his vision blurring at the edges. He had spent a lifetime surrounding himself with men who would kill for him, but not one of them had ever drawn him into a picture of happiness. That small, clumsy drawing broke something inside him more completely than any bullet could. He reached for his pen and signed a transfer order, instructing one of his shell companies to pay off Elena's medical debts under an anonymous name. It wasn't a gift. It was an apology written in the only language he still knew, action. He knew she'd refuse if she found out, but he didn't care. She deserved at least that much for bringing color back into a child's world of gray. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, echoing over the skyline, and Vincenzo wondered if perhaps the storm had been inside him all along. As he poured another glass of whiskey, he caught sight of his reflection once more, this time, not the ruthless king of New York, but a man stripped bare by his own humanity. The guilt was still there, heavy and unrelenting. But so was something else, something dangerous. Something he hadn't felt since the day he fell in love with Sophia. Hope. And as he turned out the light and left his study, leaving behind the quiet hum of the city and the ghosts of his past, one thought followed him into the dawn, that maybe redemption doesn't arrive like a gunshot or a deal, but like a poor girl with tired eyes and a kind heart, who asks for nothing and changes everything. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the New York skyline, brushing the streets in amber light that mixed uneasily with the gray mist of drizzle rolling off the harbor. Elena wiped the counter of the small cafe where she worked, the rhythmic motion of her cloth and the gentle hum of the espresso machine giving her a rare sense of peace. She still carried bruises from the night she'd saved Isabella, but the little girl's laughter had turned that pain into something almost noble. Her life had slipped back into its fragile rhythm, caring for her ailing mother, scraping tips into a jar, pretending that the shadow of the Moretti family didn't stretch to every corner of the city. She told herself Vincenzo's world would stay far away from hers. Yet the silence in her heart knew better. Something had shifted. That morning, she had found a single white rose on her doorstep, its stem wrapped in a silk ribbon, an unspoken sign that eyes were still watching. She didn't know if it came from Vincenzo's men or from the dark faces she had fought in that alley. The uncertainty hung over her like rain clouds, but she forced a smile for the next customer. When the bell above the cafe door jingled, her body instinctively stiffened. A group of men entered, nothing unusual at first glance, just construction workers seeking coffee. But the way one of them glanced too long at her name tag, the faint scar running down another's cheek, the silence that trailed behind their footsteps, all of it stirred something cold in her stomach. She pushed away the fear, took their orders, and walked to the espresso machine, the clinking cups almost drowning out her heartbeat. Outside, the street had grown eerily still. The laughter from a nearby market faded. A black van, dusted with rain, idled at the curb with its lights off. One of the men in the cafe stood, pretending to stretch, and subtly checked his phone. Elena didn't see the message flash on his screen, "Do it now." When she turned back to the table with their drinks, the door burst open so violently that the bell ripped from its mount. Two masked men stormed in. The first grabbed Elena's wrist. The second overturned chairs to block anyone from reaching her. She gasped, dropping the tray, coffee spilling across the tiles like dark blood. "Let me go!" she shouted, kicking wildly, her voice cracking with terror. One man hissed something in Italian, pressing a hand over her mouth as another patron screamed. Dishes shattered. Someone called for help. But before anyone could reach her, the men dragged Elena toward the alley behind the cafe. Her shoes scraped the floor. Her nails clawed at the walls. Rain fell harder now, washing the city into a blur of movement and sound. She struggled fiercely, every instinct in her body fighting to stay alive. Memories of Isabella's small hands in hers flashed through her mind, the innocent smile that had warmed her days. "I can't die now," she thought, "not when she still needs me." A blow landed against her ribs, forcing the air from her lungs. The taste of iron filled her mouth. She stumbled, knees hitting concrete as one of the men shouted orders. They wanted her alive, this much she sensed from their panic when she almost slipped from their grip. Her cries echoed off the alley walls, merging with the thunder. A neighbor shouted from a window, and that moment's distraction gave her the strength to twist free. She ran, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the rain. But the van screeched forward, cutting off her path. Rough hands seized her again, dragging her backward. She screamed Vincenzo's name without even realizing it. The word came from some deep place of desperation. A plea for salvation she didn't think she believed in, until headlights cut through the storm. Vincenzo's men had been watching from a distance as ordered. But even they hadn't expected such a brazen attack in daylight. The first car slammed to a halt, men in black suits spilling out with weapons drawn. The kidnappers panicked. A gunshot cracked the air, followed by the roar of engines. Elena was thrown to the ground as chaos erupted around her. The sound of shattering glass, screeching tires, and angry shouts filled the narrow space. Someone grabbed her by the shoulders, Marco, Vincenzo's right-hand man, and shouted her name, but she could barely see through the rain and blood. Another explosion of noise, the van reversed violently, smashing into a dumpster before speeding away into the maze of streets. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they belonged to no police. The Moretti men had their own way of handling justice. Marco cursed under his breath, pressing a hand against the wound on Elena's arm. "Boss is going to kill them," he muttered. She felt her vision tilt, colors blending into a strange dance of light and shadow. The rain on her face felt warm, though it was cold. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard Isabella's voice calling her name. Then darkness folded around her like a shroud. Meanwhile, across the city, Vincenzo was in a meeting when his phone buzzed. One glance at Marco's name flashing across the screen froze his blood. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. "They went after her," Marco said. That was all it took. The Mafia boss, known for his control, for his patience and precision, stood so abruptly his chair crashed backward. His men had seen him angry before, but not like this. "Get every car," he ordered, his voice low and shaking with fury. "No one rests until I find them." Outside, thunder rolled as though echoing his wrath. Within minutes, a convoy of black vehicles tore through the streets. Engines growling like beasts, the city seemed to hold its breath as Vincenzo's convoy sliced through the storm-soaked streets. Tires hissing over the wet asphalt, sirens from his security detail echoing like a dirge. When he reached the hospital, the sterile light inside stabbed at his eyes. It smelled of antiseptic, fear, and fragility, scents he never encountered in his marble halls of power. His shoes left a trail of water across the linoleum as he strode past nurses who recognized him instantly but said nothing, cowed by the aura that clung to him like smoke. Behind the glass of the emergency room, Elena lay motionless, her face pale under the harsh fluorescence, a thin line of dried blood tracing her cheek. The monitors beeped with indifferent rhythm, counting every fragile heartbeat. Vincenzo froze, the world narrowing to that single bed. For a man who had faced gunfire, betrayal, and death without flinching, the sight of that fragile woman broke something unguarded inside him. He pressed a trembling hand against the glass, fingers leaving faint prints, as if he could reach through and take the pain from her body into his own. Memories rushed through his mind, Isabella's laughter when Elena braided her hair, the shy smile she gave him when he tried to thank her, the way her voice had sounded steady despite her fear. He realized, with a hollow pang, that every ounce of humanity he thought long dead had stirred because of her. And now she might never open her eyes again. The doctor approached cautiously, shoulders tight. She's stable, for now. Significant blood loss, bruised ribs, a concussion. She's lucky. Lucky. The word tasted cruel. Vincenzo's gaze didn't move from her face as he whispered, she was attacked because of me. He knew it was true. Every enemy he'd ever made, every drop of blood spilled in his name, had found its way to this innocent woman. His jaw clenched until it hurt. Behind him, Marco stood silently, hat in hand, soaked from rain. We found their hideout, he said quietly. Orders? Vincenzo turned, eyes no longer human but something deeper, rawer, a storm contained only by will. Burn it, he said. 2 words that rippled through the corridor like thunder hours later, as dawn bled faintly through the gray sky. The old warehouse that had sheltered his rivals went up in flames, the fire staining the horizon crimson. From his car window, Vincenzo watched it without satisfaction. The blaze offered no peace, no redemption. He thought revenge might numb the ache clawing at his chest, but it only deepened it. He saw Elena again in his mind, her frail hands, the way she'd refused his money, the quiet dignity in her eyes when she'd said she just wanted his daughter safe. That memory cut deeper than any bullet wound he'd ever taken. Back at the hospital, Isabella had fallen asleep in a chair beside Elena's bed, her small fingers clutching the woman's hand. The sight pierced him. His daughter had not slept so soundly since her mother's death. For the first time in years, he sat beside them both, the invincible Mafia boss reduced to a father and a man on his knees. He brushed a strand of hair from Isabella's forehead and looked at Elena again. Words formed inside him, unspoken but burning, if she lives, I'll change everything. It wasn't a promise to God or fate, it was a vow to himself. The rain outside softened to a whisper, tapping gently against the window as if offering mercy. Vincenzo lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that no one in his empire would ever dare to imagine. The world outside would remember the night he burned his enemies alive, but within those walls, the truth was quieter and infinitely more powerful. The feared Mafia boss wept for the woman who had taught his daughter to smile again and, without knowing it, had begun to teach him how to be human once more. Morning crept gently through the hospital blinds, brushing Elena's face with the kind of soft light that feels like forgiveness after a long storm. The rhythmic beep of machines and the distant murmur of footsteps were the only sounds in the quiet room, yet something else filled the air, a warmth, a steady presence that didn't belong to this sterile place. When her eyes fluttered open, blurred by sleep and pain, the first thing she saw wasn't the ceiling or the nurse's silhouette but Vincenzo, sitting silently at her bedside. His dark suit was wrinkled, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. But the moment her gaze met his, something unspoken passed between them, relief, disbelief, gratitude, and something softer neither of them dared to name. She tried to sit up, wincing as the bandages across her ribs tugged painfully. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They'll come for you. He shook his head slowly, his expression firm yet full of something achingly human. Let them, he murmured. They'll never touch you again. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who commanded armies and yet trembled at the thought of losing one fragile soul. For a moment, Elena could only stare at him. The contrast between his power and his gentleness disarming her more than any wound could. Vincenzo leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes never leaving her face. You didn't just save my daughter, he said softly. You saved me, Elena. His words hung in the air like a confession. She blinked, unsure how to respond, the weight of his gaze pressing against the walls she'd built around her heart. He looked older now, not in years but in exhaustion, in the kind of weariness that comes from a lifetime of sin suddenly meeting grace. The fear that had always clung to his name dissolved in her presence, replaced by something painfully pure. He reached for her hand, rough from years of command but trembling as it closed around hers. Rest, he said, almost pleading. You're safe now. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe it. The world outside might still be full of men who wanted to harm her. But here, in this small, dim room, she felt untouchable. As the days passed, her strength returned slowly, like dawn rising after an endless night. Vincenzo kept his promise with the precision of a man used to controlling every detail of life and death. 2 men stood outside her hospital door at all hours. A private nurse tended to her every need. Fresh flowers arrived every morning, though she suspected he wasn't the one choosing them. He didn't seem like a man who knew the language of petals. Yet every gesture, from the new dress folded neatly on the chair to the carefully cooked meals from Isabella's favorite chef, carried the same silent message: you matter now. When she was well enough to walk again, he helped her out of the hospital himself, his hand steadying her arm as if she were made of glass. Cameras flashed secretly from corners. People whispered as they passed. Everyone in the city had heard the rumors, the untouchable Mafia boss now seen escorting a poor waitress. But Vincenzo didn't care. His world, once ruled by fear, had shifted around this one woman who didn't belong to it. He moved her and her mother into a guarded home on the outskirts of the city, a place surrounded by gardens and silence. "You'll be safe here," he said simply. Elena protested at first, insisting she couldn't accept such generosity, but he silenced her gently. "You gave me something money can't buy," he said. "This is nothing." And it wasn't just talk. Every corner of her new life bore his quiet care. When her mother's medication ran low, it was refilled before she could ask. When she woke at night from nightmares, someone was always stationed outside her door. But what comforted her most wasn't the security or the luxury, it was knowing that every evening, without fail, Vincenzo would arrive to check on them. Sometimes he brought Isabella, who would leap into Elena's arms and chatter endlessly about school and the stray cat she'd found. Sometimes he came alone, sitting on the porch with a cigarette unlit between his fingers, watching the stars as though searching for answers he could never find. Elena found herself drawn to those silences. She would sit beside him, the air thick with unspoken words. "You don't have to guard me forever," she told him one night, her voice quiet but steady. He turned to her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "I know," he said. "But I want to." The sincerity in his tone startled her. For a man surrounded by power and deceit, he spoke to her with a kind of naked honesty that made her heart ache. Over time, their conversations grew deeper, softer. He told her little about his past, only fragments: a childhood in Sicily, a father who taught him that love was weakness, the day he learned that fear could be currency. She listened without judgment, her eyes full of compassion. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a name whispered in fear but as a man. And that frightened him more than any rival ever had, yet beneath the tenderness, danger still simmered. There were calls late at night, coded messages from his men. He never spoke of them near her, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the shadow in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Once, when she caught a glimpse of blood on his cuff, he brushed it off with a lie too gentle to question. But even then, he never let that darkness reach her door. The more she healed, the more she realized what his promise truly meant. It wasn't just protection from others. It was protection from the world he belonged to. And somehow, he seemed willing to fight even himself to keep that vow. One evening, as they watched Isabella chase fireflies across the garden, Elena turned to him. "Why me?" she asked softly. "You could have anyone, Vincenzo. Women who belong to your world." He looked at her, the glow of the porch light catching the faint scars on his face, and said quietly, "Because you're the only one who never asked for anything." His answer struck her deeper than she expected. She wanted to tell him that all she'd ever wanted was peace, a life free of violence and fear. But looking at him now, his face softened by the sight of his daughter's laughter, she realized he was trying to give her exactly that. And perhaps, in his own way, he was asking for the same. As weeks melted into months, a fragile routine formed between them, breakfasts shared in comfortable silence. Isabella's laughter filling the house, small glances that lingered a little too long. The city still whispered stories about them, calling Elena the woman who tamed a devil, the light that found its way into a kingdom of shadows. She ignored the rumors. She only knew the truth she saw in his eyes when he looked at her, an unspoken gratitude, a yearning he could never voice. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, she caught him standing by her doorway, watching to make sure she was safe, his expression unreadable. In those moments, she realized that his promise had become more than words, it had become a way of living. A silent devotion that neither of them fully understood but both could feel with every heartbeat. And so, as the nights grew softer and the city calmed around them, Elena began to heal, not just from her wounds but from the fear that had once ruled her life. And Vincenzo, the man who had commanded armies and buried countless sins, found himself learning how to breathe again, one heartbeat, one glance, one promise at a time. In that fragile peace between them, something new was quietly born, a bond neither could name yet both silently vowed to protect. Even if it meant standing against the world itself, weeks turned into months. And the cold, merciless rhythm of Vincenzo Moretti's empire began to slow, softened by the warmth that had crept quietly into his life in the form of one woman and her gentle defiance. He still woke before dawn, his instincts sharpened by decades of danger. But now the first thing he reached for was not a weapon or a phone, it was the memory of Elena's voice. Calm and low, humming softly as she brewed morning coffee in the house he'd once called a fortress. There was something disarmingly ordinary about her presence in his world of armored cars and whispered threats. She didn't belong to that darkness, and yet she had made a place within it, reshaping it with laughter and light. Isabella adored her, clung to her, even, and the house that had once been filled only with silence and echoes of loss now carried the music of a child's joy and a woman's soft footsteps. Vincenzo would often find himself pausing outside the door just to listen, Elena reading stories to Isabella, their laughter spilling down the hall like sunlight. He never entered immediately, afraid to break the fragile peace he still didn't believe he deserved. The men who guarded his estate noticed the change too. Their boss, once a figure carved from stone, now lingered at windows, lost in thought, a faint smile sometimes ghosting across his lips. Some whispered that love had made him weak. Others knew it had made him more dangerous than ever, for a man who finally had something to lose was a man no one dared to test. Each day he visited Elena, though he never called it that. Sometimes he brought rare teas for her mother, sometimes small gifts for Isabella. But the truth was simpler, he needed to see her. To remind himself that the chaos of his world hadn't swallowed everything pure. Their conversations grew longer with each visit, shifting from cautious politeness to quiet familiarity. He told her about his mother's garden in Sicily, about the smell of lemons in summer, and she shared stories of her childhood, of nights spent dreaming of a life beyond poverty. They spoke softly, as if afraid the moment might shatter. The line between gratitude and affection blurred until even Vincenzo, who had spent a lifetime mastering control, found himself undone by the sight of her smile. It terrified him, how easily she could disarm him without even trying. There were moments when he caught himself reaching for her hand across the table, then hesitating, the weight of who he was pulling him back. Yet she always looked at him with the same calm steadiness, as though she could see the man beneath the reputation, the father beneath the crime lord. And little by little, he began to believe she could point. One evening, the city lay bathed in the golden glow of sunset, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked stone and distant jasmine. Vincenzo stood on the balcony of his mansion, overlooking the endless stretch of skyline that had once symbolized his power. But tonight, it felt small, almost meaningless. Elena joined him quietly, her dress fluttering in the soft breeze, her hair catching the dying light like threads of fire. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, memorizing the way her presence softened everything around her. When he finally turned to her, his voice was low, roughened by emotion. "You brought light into a world full of darkness, Elena," he said. "I don't deserve it, but I can't let you go." She looked at him, her eyes glistening in the amber light, the reflection of his pain and longing mirrored in her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence between them felt like a fragile bridge built over a lifetime of sorrow. Then she whispered, her voice trembling, "Even the coldest hearts can love again." The words hit him like absolution. Vincenzo, the man feared by nations, who had spent his life commanding death, suddenly felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He reached for her hand, hesitating only a heartbeat before pressing his lips to her skin, a gesture so tender it felt foreign even to him. In that touch was everything he could never say: gratitude, guilt, wonder, and a quiet plea for forgiveness. He didn't tell her that she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the man he used to be before violence became his language. He didn't tell her how many times he'd woken in the night, fearing he might lose her as he'd lost everything else. But she seemed to know anyway. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise that she wasn't running. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The city below continued its restless heartbeat, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in the heart of its most dangerous man. For a fleeting moment, Vincenzo allowed himself to imagine a life beyond blood and vengeance, a life where mornings began with laughter instead of orders, where his daughter could grow up free of fear, where love wasn't a weakness but a salvation. And for the first time in years, he dared to believe it might be possible. But love, in Vincenzo's world, was a dangerous thing. It made men reckless, made them human again, and humanity was a weakness enemies smelled from miles away. He tried to hide it, bury it beneath the armor of his old self, but every time Elena smiled, the mask cracked a little more. She would walk into a room and the noise in his head, the noise that had followed him since his first kill, would quiet, replaced by something terrifyingly gentle. His men noticed the change. They'd never seen their boss linger over dinner, never seen him walk through the garden with a woman instead of an army. And though none dared speak it aloud, everyone understood. Elena was no longer just the woman who saved his daughter. She was the woman who saved him. One night, a storm rolled in, the kind that turned the sky black and the sea violent. Lightning flashed across the windows as thunder rattled the walls, but inside, the mansion was still. Vincenzo stood by the fire, lost in thought, when Elena appeared behind him, her voice barely a whisper. "You can't keep punishing yourself for the past," she said. "You're not the man you were." He turned to her, his eyes dark and tired. "Men like me don't change," he said. "We just learn to hide the monsters better." She shook her head gently and stepped closer, until their faces were inches apart. Maybe the monster just needed someone to remind him he's still human. The words struck something deep in him. For years, Vincenzo had carried guilt like a shadow, every life taken, every promise broken, every ounce of innocence lost. He'd built an empire of fear to protect the small, wounded part of himself that still remembered love, but Elena had found that part effortlessly, without trying, without judgment. When she placed a hand on his chest, he realized for the first time how long it had been since anyone had touched him without fear or motive. His breath caught. Her eyes searched his, not for the Mafia king, but for the man beneath the armor. And in that moment, Vincenzo finally let his walls fall. He took her hand and held it against his heart, his voice low, trembling. "You don't understand what it means to love me," he said. "Everything I touch, it turns to ash." Elena's eyes glistened, but she didn't pull away. "Then let me be your fireproof heart," she whispered. Something inside him broke, something old and heavy and cruel, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a man used to taking, but of a man finally learning how to give. The rain outside turned to a downpour, drumming softly against the glass as the firelight danced across their faces. For once, the house didn't feel haunted. The ghosts that used to whisper his sins seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the sound of Elena's steady breathing and the faint laughter of Isabella from upstairs. Vincenzo looked into Elena's eyes and saw something he had long forgotten existed: peace. He knew the world outside would never understand, that his enemies would use his love as a weapon against him, but for now, none of it mattered. For the first time in years, he wasn't planning, wasn't protecting, wasn't killing. He was simply living. And that terrified him more than any bullet ever could. Days turned into nights, and nights into something softer, quieter. They would sit together in the garden, Isabella between them, the three of them watching the stars in silence. Elena would tell stories about hope and forgiveness, and Vincenzo would listen, not as the boss, not as the feared name that made men tremble, but as a man who finally understood what family truly meant. Every small smile from Elena, every laugh from his daughter, stitched together the broken pieces of his soul. Love had found him in the shadows, not to erase his past, but to give him a reason to rise above it. And though Vincenzo knew darkness would always follow him, he also knew one truth he could never unlearn: even the coldest hearts can learn to love again years later. The morning sun bathed the Moretti estate in a soft, golden glow. The kind that carried warmth even to the coldest corners of memory. The gardens, once a fortress of stone and shadows, were now alive with color, roses climbing the marble walls, lavender dancing in the wind, and the laughter of a young girl echoing between the fountains. Isabella's laughter. She ran barefoot across the dewy grass, chasing a butterfly with the same wild joy only children untouched by pain could possess. Elena sat on a bench beneath the blooming wisteria, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes following Isabella's every move with tender adoration. Beside her, Vincenzo watched too, silent but full, his heart no longer the hollow fortress it once was. His once cold gaze now softened whenever it met Elena's. And though his face bore the lines of time and the marks of his violent past, there was something gentle in the way he smiled now, like a man who had finally made peace with his ghosts. The world around him had changed, and so had he. The empire that once ran on fear now breathed through compassion. No more hidden guns beneath tables, no more blood oaths whispered in smoke-filled rooms. Instead, his men, those who had once followed him into war, now followed him into rebuilding. Where he had once destroyed, he now restored. Abandoned neighborhoods were turned into homes for the poor, schools for children whose only future used to be crime, and shelters named after Elena's late mother, Rosa, the woman whose spirit had guided a daughter to fight for good even when the world gave her nothing. The city that had once trembled at the sound of the Moretti name now whispered it with respect, sometimes even gratitude. Reporters began calling it the Mafia boss's redemption, printing stories about the man who traded vengeance for mercy. But to Vincenzo, none of it was about redemption or headlines. It was about Elena, about the woman who had walked into his darkness with nothing but courage and a kind heart, and taught him that love was not a weakness but the only kind of power worth having. Every brick laid, every child fed, every life changed, he saw it all as a tribute to her, to the day she stood in that rain-soaked alley and refused to walk away. Sometimes, late at night, he would find her standing by the balcony, the city lights painting her in gold, and he would think to himself that if angels existed, they didn't come with wings, they came with hearts like hers. Isabella had grown into a reflection of both worlds, the fierce resilience of her father and the warmth of Elena's love. She would sneak into Vincenzo's office with drawings for his desk, insisting that every meeting needed more colors and less frowns. The men who once guarded his empire now adored her like uncles, their hardened faces melting whenever she called them by name. Vincenzo often found himself watching her and realizing that the laughter of a child was more powerful than the fear of 1,000 men. Sometimes, he wondered how different life might have been if Elena hadn't appeared that night in the alley, but then he stopped himself, because that kind of miracle didn't need explanation. It simply was. Elena's life, too, had changed. The small apartment she once struggled to pay for was long gone, replaced by a home filled with love and laughter, not luxury. She still worked, only now, it was by choice. She managed the shelters that bore her mother's name, visiting every week to cook meals and listen to the stories of lost souls trying to find their way. People whispered about her too, the woman who tamed the Mafia boss, but she never liked that phrase. She hadn't tamed him. She had simply seen the man beneath the monster and refused to look away. When she walked through the gardens, Vincenzo would sometimes join her in silence. And though words were rare between them in those moments, everything that needed to be said lived in the quiet space between their hearts. One afternoon, as they sat watching the sunset over the vineyard, Elena turned to him and said softly, "Do you ever think about the past?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Every day," he admitted. "But not the way I used to. I used to think of what I'd lost. Now I think of what I almost lost, you and her." His voice cracked on the last word, and Elena's eyes filled with warmth. She reached out, resting her hand on his. Then maybe the past did something right, after all. He looked at her then, the woman who had turned a weapon into a man, who had given a killer the courage to be kind, and smiled. "You saved my daughter," he said quietly. "And you saved me too." The words lingered in the air like a vow, like a prayer whispered to a God he no longer believed in but still hoped was listening. Elena didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned her head on his shoulder, and together they watched Isabella chase the last rays of sunlight across the garden. The moment was simple, but to Vincenzo, it was everything. No power, no money, no empire could ever compare to the peace he felt sitting there beside the two souls who had given his life meaning. As evening fell, lights flickered across the city, a city once broken, now breathing again. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not for a funeral or a deal, but for a wedding nearby, for love that had survived. Vincenzo listened and smiled faintly, his heart quiet. The man who once ruled by fear now ruled only himself, guided by love, humility, and purpose. In that silence, as the first stars appeared above the horizon, he realized something he never had before: redemption wasn't a destination. It was a choice you made every day. And he had chosen it, because of her. Inside, Isabella ran to them, her hair wild from play, a small flower clutched in her hand. "For Mama Elena," she said proudly, tucking it behind Elena's ear. Vincenzo's chest tightened at the sight, and for the first time, he didn't hide the tears that welled in his eyes. Elena looked up at him, smiling through her own. "See," she whispered. "Even in your world, there's beauty." He nodded slowly, his voice a soft tremor. "No," he said, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Because of you, there is." The night deepened around them, the garden alive with fireflies and the soft hum of life. Elena, Vincenzo, and Isabella sat together beneath the wisteria tree, wrapped in the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. In another life, Vincenzo might have been feared until the day he died. But in this one, he would be remembered as a man who dared to change, for love, for family, for the promise of a better tomorrow. And as the stars glittered above them, he finally allowed himself to believe what Elena had always known: even the darkest souls can find their way back to the light.